A mother screamed that I was an animal and demanded my arrest for hurting her precious angel during boxing practice. She tried to storm the ring, threatened to sue everyone, and what happened next completely destroyed her reputation in our small town forever. My name is Alex Wilson, I'm 14 years old, and this story happened 3 months ago at Mitchell's Boxing Academy, where I've been training for almost 2 years. What started as a normal sparring session turned into the most dramatic scene I've ever witnessed, and it taught me more about human nature than any life lesson ever could. 2 years ago, my stepdad Robert brought me to Mitchell's Boxing Academy after I'd been getting bullied at school for months. I was skinnier than most kids my age, kept to myself, and seemed to attract trouble wherever I went. The bullies would corner me in the hallways, push me around during lunch, and I felt completely helpless. Robert had trained in martial arts during his military service, and he believed that learning to fight back would give me the self-respect I was missing. The gym quickly became my refuge, a place where I could transform my fear into power. Coach Mitchell was a retired professional boxer who had fought in the light heavyweight division for over a decade. He ran his gym like a tight ship, demanding respect and discipline from everyone who walked through those doors. He had this way of seeing potential in kids that others had written off. Under his tough but fair guidance, I slowly evolved from a scared kid into someone who could defend himself. Those first few months were absolute torture. My hands were constantly wrapped in ice after training, my shoulders screamed with pain, and I collapsed into bed exhausted every night. But something incredible started happening around the 6-month mark. I began to move differently. My footwork became fluid, my punches started snapping with real power, and most importantly, I started believing in myself. The other fighters at the gym began treating me with respect instead of pity. I wasn't just a scared new kid anymore. I was becoming a real boxer. The gym itself was like stepping into another world. It smelled like leather, sweat, and determination. The walls were covered with photos of former champions who had trained there, local newspaper clippings celebrating victories, and motivational quotes that Coach Mitchell had carefully selected over the years. There was this energy in the air that made you want to push harder, hit stronger, and never give up. Most of the guys who trained there were older than me, some in their 20s and 30s, but they treated me like a little brother. They'd give me tips on technique, share stories about their own fights, and always made sure I felt included. There was Miguel, a college student who was training for the Golden Gloves tournament. There was Tommy, a construction worker who used boxing to stay in shape and blow off steam after long days. And there was Derek, a former Marine who had found peace in the discipline of training. Then there was this other kid who started coming to the gym about 6 months after I did. His name was Brandon Hayes, and he was also 14, but he was completely different from me. Where I had started as a scared kid looking to build confidence, Brandon came in acting like he already knew everything. His mother, Patricia Hayes, would drop him off and pick him up every day, and from the very beginning it was clear that she treated her son like he was made of glass. Brandon was decent at boxing, don't get me wrong, but he had this attitude problem that rubbed everyone the wrong way. He'd complain when drills got too hard, make excuses when he got tired, and worst of all, he'd blame others when things didn't go his way during training. Coach Mitchell tried to work with him, tried to instill the same discipline and respect that he taught all of us, but Brandon seemed resistant to really pushing himself. Mrs. Hayes was even worse. She would arrive early for pickup sometimes and watch through the windows, wincing every time her son took even the lightest hit during training. She'd pepper Coach Mitchell with questions about safety equipment, ask if the other boys were being too rough with her baby, and constantly worried that boxing was too dangerous for someone as special as Brandon. I remember Coach Mitchell pulling Brandon aside one day after a particularly whiny training session. "Son," he said in that calm but firm voice of his, "boxing isn't just about throwing punches. It's about building character, learning to push through adversity, and developing respect for yourself and others. But you've got to want it. You've got to be willing to get uncomfortable." Brandon just shrugged and mumbled something about how he was trying his best, but it was obvious to everyone that his heart wasn't really in it. He was there because his mom thought it would be good for him, not because he had any real passion for the sport. The contrast between Brandon and me couldn't have been more obvious. While I was hungry to improve, always staying after practice to work on technique or ask Coach Mitchell questions, Brandon was usually the first one out the door when training ended. While I took criticism and coaching as opportunities to get better, Brandon would get defensive and make excuses. This went on for months. The atmosphere in the gym started to shift whenever Brandon was around. The other fighters would roll their eyes when he complained, and Coach Mitchell's patience was clearly wearing thin. But Coach was a professional, and he never gave up on any of his fighters, even the difficult ones. Things really started to come to a head about 3 months ago. I had been training consistently for almost 2 years at that point, and my skills had improved dramatically. I could hold my own with guys who were older and bigger than me. My confidence had grown not just in the ring, but in every aspect of my life. The bullies at school had backed off completely once word got around that I was training at Mitchell's. I walked taller, spoke more clearly, and felt like I could handle whatever life threw at me. Brandon, on the other hand, had plateaued. He'd been training for over a year, but his attitude problems were holding him back. He wasn't improving at the same rate as other fighters because he wasn't putting in the same effort. This created a growing gap between his expectations and his actual abilities. One Tuesday evening in March, Coach Mitchell announced that he wanted to do some sparring sessions with the younger fighters. This wasn't unusual. Sparring was a regular part of our training, and it was essential for developing real fighting skills. You can hit the heavy bag all day long, but nothing prepares you for the unpredictability of facing another person who's trying to hit you back. "Alex, Brandon, I want you two to spar together tonight," Coach Mitchell announced. "You're both the same age, similar weight class, and you've both been training long enough to handle it." I felt a surge of excitement. I loved sparring. It was where all the technique and conditioning came together. It was where you found out what you were really made of. Brandon, however, looked nervous. "Coach, I don't think I'm ready for that yet," Brandon said, glancing toward the windows where his mother's car wasn't supposed to arrive for another hour. "You've been training for over a year, son," Coach Mitchell replied firmly. "You're as ready as you're going to be. Besides, Alex here started sparring after just 8 months of training. It's time to see what you've learned." We spent the next 20 minutes warming up, going through our usual routine of jumping rope, shadow boxing, and working on the heavy bags. I could feel the anticipation building in my chest. I'd sparred with Brandon a few times before, but always in very controlled circumstances, with Coach Mitchell stopping the action every few seconds to give instruction. As we were wrapping our hands and putting on our headgear, I noticed that Brandon kept glancing toward the door. Unknown to Coach Mitchell or anyone else, his mother had decided to come early that day. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot, and through the large windows of the gym, she had a perfect view of the ring. Coach Mitchell called us to the center of the ring and gave us the standard pre-sparring instructions. "Keep it light, focus on technique over power, protect yourselves at all times, and listen to my commands. This is about learning, not about hurting each other. Touch gloves and come out boxing." Brandon and I touched gloves, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. I felt bad for him in a way. He was clearly out of his comfort zone. But that's exactly where growth happens. That's what Coach Mitchell had taught all of us. The first round started, and immediately I could tell that Brandon was hesitant. He was keeping his distance, throwing tentative jabs that had no real commitment behind them. I stayed patient, working behind my jab, moving my feet, and looking for openings. This was exactly what I'd been training for. About a minute into the round, I saw an opening. Brandon dropped his right hand slightly after throwing a weak jab, and I stepped in with a clean left hook to his ribs. It wasn't a hard shot by any means, but it was solid and it landed clean. Brandon gasped and took a step back, more from surprise than pain. "Good shot, Alex," Coach Mitchell called out. "Brandon, keep your hands up and don't reach with those jabs." I could see Brandon getting frustrated. He tried to respond with a combination, but his footwork was sloppy and I was able to slip most of his punches and counter with short hooks and uppercuts. Nothing too hard, just clean, technical boxing. As the round continued, the gap in our skill levels became more and more apparent. I was controlling the distance, landing the cleaner shots, and making Brandon miss. This wasn't about me being stronger or more athletic. This was about 2 years of dedicated training versus a year and a half of half-hearted effort. I landed a particularly nice 1-2 combination that snapped Brandon's head back slightly. Again, nothing vicious, just good, clean boxing. But I could see that his pride was starting to get hurt. He was used to being treated like he was special, and now he was getting outboxed by someone he probably thought he could beat easily. "Time!" Coach Mitchell called, ending the first round. We went to our corners and Coach Mitchell came over to give us both some quick instruction. "Alex, excellent work. You're staying relaxed, picking your shots well, and your defense is solid. Keep doing exactly what you're doing." Then he turned to Brandon. "Son, you're tensing up and telegraphing your punches. Remember what we've worked on. Stay loose, trust your training, and stop dropping your hands." I could see Brandon's face getting red, and not just from exertion. He was embarrassed, and that's dangerous in the ring because it makes you do stupid things. The second round started, and Brandon came out much more aggressively. The problem was, aggression without technique just makes you an easier target. He started throwing wild hooks and overhand rights, leaving himself completely open for counters. I stayed calm and patient, just like Coach Mitchell had taught me. When Brandon rushed in throwing sloppy punches, I'd step to the side and counter with short hooks to his body or uppercuts to his chin. Every shot I threw was clean and controlled. About halfway through the second round, I caught Brandon with what was probably the best combination I'd ever thrown in sparring. He came in with a wild right hand. I slipped it to my left and came back with a left hook to his body, followed immediately by a right uppercut that caught him flush on the chin. The shots weren't thrown with bad intentions, but they were perfectly timed and placed. Brandon stumbled backward and grabbed onto the ropes, more stunned than hurt, but clearly outclassed. "Stop!" Coach Mitchell called immediately, stepping between us. "Let's take a break." Brandon was breathing heavily and looking around the gym like he wasn't sure where he was. That's when I noticed his mother had gotten out of her car and was now standing at the windows, watching everything with a horrified expression on her face. Coach Mitchell checked on Brandon, making sure he was okay, and then started to explain what had happened from a technical standpoint. "Brandon, you rushed in without setting up your shots, and Alex countered perfectly. That's exactly why we work on defense so much. Alex, outstanding combination work there." But before Coach Mitchell could continue his instruction, the front door of the gym burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. "What the hell is going on here?" screamed a voice that made everyone in the gym freeze. Mrs. Patricia Hayes stormed into the gym like a woman possessed, her face red with rage, her eyes locked on me like I was some kind of criminal. She was a small woman, probably in her early 40s, but the fury radiating from her made her seem much larger and more intimidating. "You animal! You absolute animal!" she screamed, pointing directly at me. "How dare you hurt my baby like that? How dare you attack him?" The entire gym went silent. The guys who had been working on the heavy bags stopped mid-punch. Miguel, who had been jumping rope in the corner, let his rope fall to the floor. Tommy and Derek, who had been doing pad work, turned to stare at the unfolding scene. Coach Mitchell immediately stepped forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mrs. Hayes, please, let me explain what happened here. The boys were engaged in supervised sparring, which is a normal part of boxing training." "Normal?" she shrieked. "There's nothing normal about letting this thug beat up my son. Look at him. Look what this monster did to my angel." Brandon, who was standing by the ropes looking more embarrassed than injured, tried to speak up. "Mom, please, I'm fine. It's just sparring. It's what we do here." But Mrs. Hayes completely ignored her son, keeping her fury directed at me and Coach Mitchell. "I don't want to hear it. This is assault. This is child abuse. I'm calling the police right now." She pulled out her phone and started dialing, all while continuing to scream accusations. "You people are running some kind of fight club here. You're teaching children to be violent. This is completely unacceptable." I stood in the ring, still wearing my headgear and gloves, completely stunned by what was happening. I'd been in plenty of sparring sessions before, and they were always treated as learning experiences. Sure, sometimes people got hit harder than expected, but that was part of the sport. Nobody had ever reacted like this before. Coach Mitchell remained incredibly calm despite the chaos. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand you're upset, but I need you to lower your voice and listen to reason. Your son signed up for boxing training. Boxing involves physical contact. Every parent who enrolls their child here signs a waiver acknowledging the risks involved in combat sports." "I don't care about any waiver," she screamed back. "No waiver gives you the right to let this animal attack my child. I want him arrested. I want him banned from this gym. I want all of you prosecuted." At this point, she actually tried to climb through the ropes and enter the ring. I instinctively stepped backward, not out of fear for my safety, but because the whole situation had become so surreal that I didn't know how to react. Tommy, the construction worker, quickly moved to intercept her. "Ma'am, you need to stay out of the ring. This is a training facility and you're disrupting the session. Don't you dare tell me what I can and can't do," she screamed at Tommy. "My son was assaulted and I have every right to protect him." Miguel stepped forward as well, adding his voice to the attempt to calm things down. "Mrs. Hayes, Alex is a good kid. He wasn't trying to hurt Brandon. This is just how sparring works." But Mrs. Hayes was beyond reason at this point. She turned her fury on Miguel next. "You're all in on this. You're all part of this violence. I'm going to shut this place down. I'm going to make sure every parent in this town knows what kind of dangerous thugs you're raising here." Coach Mitchell's patience was clearly being tested, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Hayes, if you continue to disrupt my gym and threaten my fighters, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Your son is welcome to continue training here, but only if you can accept that boxing is a contact sport. This seemed to push her completely over the edge. My son will never set foot in this hellhole again, and neither will any other decent child once I'm done exposing what you people really are. She grabbed Brandon by the arm and started dragging him toward the exit. The poor kid looked mortified. He kept trying to say something to his mother, but she wasn't listening to him at all. "Mom, please, you're embarrassing me," I heard Brandon say as they reached the door. "I knew this might happen. It's part of boxing. Don't you defend these animals," she snapped back at her own son. "You should be thanking me for protecting you." Just before they left, Mrs. Hayes turned around one last time and pointed directly at me. "You're a menace to society, and everyone is going to know it. I'm calling the newspaper, I'm calling the school board, I'm calling everyone who will listen. This isn't over." And with that, she dragged her humiliated son out of the gym, slamming the door behind them with such force that the windows rattled. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the gym just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. I was still standing in the ring, feeling like I was in some kind of alternate reality. Finally, Coach Mitchell spoke up, his voice calm but tired. "Well, gentlemen, that was certainly something none of us expected. Alex, come here, son." I walked over to where Coach Mitchell was standing, still not sure if I had done something wrong. "Coach, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of that to happen. I was just doing what you taught me." Coach Mitchell put his hand on my shoulder and looked me directly in the eyes. "Son, you have absolutely nothing to apologize for. What you did in that ring tonight was textbook boxing. You showed excellent technique, perfect control, and outstanding sportsmanship. You did everything exactly right." Tommy nodded in agreement. "Kid, I've been boxing for 15 years, and that was some of the cleanest sparring I've ever seen. You didn't do anything wrong." Miguel added, "That lady was completely out of line. You were just doing what boxers do." Derek, the former Marine, spoke up with conviction. "Son, in my military career I've seen real violence. What you did tonight wasn't violence. It was sport. It was training. That woman has no idea what she's talking about." Over the next few days, Mrs. Hayes made good on her threats to spread her version of events around town. She called the local newspaper, although they declined to run a story about what they considered a non-incident at a legitimate sports facility. She posted angry rants on social media, but most people who knew anything about boxing dismissed her complaints as the overreaction of an overprotective parent. She did file a complaint with the police, but after speaking with Coach Mitchell and reviewing the gym's insurance policies and safety protocols, they determined that no laws had been broken and no further action was warranted. The most dramatic consequence of her campaign came about a week later. Mrs. Hayes had been telling her version of events to anyone who would listen, painting me as some kind of violent bully and Coach Mitchell's gym as a dangerous place where children were allowed to hurt each other. Word of her campaign got back to some of the other parents whose children trained at the gym, and they were not happy. These were parents who understood what boxing was about, who appreciated what Coach Mitchell was doing for their kids, and who were offended by Mrs. Hayes' attempts to damage the reputation of a business and people they respected. Mrs. Hayes worked as a receptionist at a local dental office, and several of the gym parents happened to be patients there. When they heard about what she was doing, they decided to take their business elsewhere and made sure the dentist knew why. But the real consequence came when Mrs. Hayes tried to organize other parents at Brandon's school to support her crusade against the gym. She called a meeting and invited parents to come hear about the dangerous situation she had discovered. Only 3 parents showed up, and 2 of them left once they realized what the meeting was actually about. The third parent who stayed was Derek's wife, Linda, whose son also trained at the gym. Linda later told us what happened at that meeting. She said Mrs. Hayes spent an hour ranting about violence and thugs and dangerous gyms. But when Linda asked her to explain exactly what boxing training involved and whether she had researched the sport before enrolling her son, Mrs. Hayes couldn't give coherent answers. It became clear pretty quickly, Linda told us, that this woman had no idea what she had signed her son up for. And instead of taking responsibility for her own ignorance, she was blaming everyone else. The final nail in the coffin came when Linda asked Mrs. Hayes if she had actually watched her son's training sessions before the day of the incident. Mrs. Hayes admitted that she had not, that she had just dropped Brandon off and picked him up without ever observing what went on inside the gym. "So let me get this straight," Linda had said. "You enrolled your son in boxing training without researching what that involved. You never bothered to watch his sessions to understand what he was learning, and now you're angry that boxing involves getting hit." According to Linda, Mrs. Hayes couldn't come up with a response to that, and the meeting ended shortly afterward. Within 2 weeks of the incident, Mrs. Hayes had become something of a local laughingstock. People who knew the situation started referring to her as that crazy boxing mom, or the woman who thought boxing should be non-contact. Her social media posts became increasingly unhinged, which only made her look more unreasonable to anyone who might have initially sympathized with her position. Brandon, meanwhile, never returned to the gym. I heard from some kids at school that he was mortified by his mother's behavior and had asked to quit boxing altogether. A few people said he was interested in trying out for the wrestling team instead, which made sense since it would be easier for him to participate without his mother's direct involvement. I actually felt bad for Brandon. He wasn't a bad kid, just someone whose mother had sheltered him too much and never let him develop the resilience that comes from facing challenges and occasional failures. If she had handled the situation differently, if she had talked to Coach Mitchell calmly and tried to understand what boxing training involved, Brandon might have continued training and eventually developed into a decent fighter. Instead, her overreaction had robbed her son of an opportunity to grow, to learn about himself, and to develop confidence through overcoming adversity. As for me, the whole experience taught me valuable lessons that extended far beyond boxing. I learned that no matter how well you conduct yourself, there will always be people who misunderstand your actions or motivations. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means staying calm, letting others make fools of themselves, and trusting that reasonable people will see the truth. Most importantly, I learned that my training at Mitchell's gym was about much more than learning to throw punches. It was about developing character, learning to handle pressure, and building the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can face whatever life throws at you. Coach Mitchell used the incident as a teaching moment for all of us. "Gentlemen," he said during one of our training sessions, "what happened with Mrs. Hayes is exactly why we emphasize respect and discipline in this gym. Boxing gives you physical tools, but more importantly, it builds mental strength. When people attack your character or your actions, you don't need to fight them with your fists. You fight them by continuing to be the kind of person your training has made you." 3 months later, I'm still training at Mitchell's gym, still improving, and still grateful for everything the sport has given me. The incident with Mrs. Hayes has become something of a legend at the gym, a story that gets told to new fighters as an example of how some people completely misunderstand what we're about. I've had several more sparring sessions since then, including some with fighters who are older and more experienced than me. Each time, I'm reminded of how much I've learned and how much more there is to discover about myself through boxing. The bullies who used to target me at school now give me a wide berth, not because they're afraid I'll hit them, but because they can see the confidence I carry myself with. The scared, timid kid who walked into Mitchell's gym 2 years ago is gone, replaced by someone who knows his worth and isn't afraid to stand up for himself when necessary. Looking back on that Tuesday evening in March, I realized that Mrs. Hayes did me a favor without meaning to. Her overreaction and subsequent public embarrassment served as a perfect example of what happens when emotions override reason, when pride gets in the way of understanding, and when protecting someone from every difficulty ultimately makes them weaker rather than stronger. I learned that day that I had become exactly what Coach Mitchell and my dad and my Uncle David had hoped I would become. Not a bully, not a thug, not an animal as Mrs. Hayes had called me, but a young man who could defend himself, who could stay calm under pressure, and who could conduct himself with dignity even when others around him were losing their minds. That mother tried to destroy my reputation and shut down the gym that had given me so much. Instead, she ended up destroying her own credibility and proving to everyone who witnessed her behavior exactly what kind of person she really was. And me? I'm still here, still training, still learning, and still grateful for every lesson that boxing has taught me about fighting, about life, and about the kind of man I want to become. Sometimes the best victory is simply refusing to be dragged down to someone else's level, and that night I learned that lesson better than any textbook could have taught me.